Welcome everyone to week 6. For week 6, we're looking at competitive markets and how they make decisions. And also for this week, you have your midterm exam. So let's go over the midterm exam and some of the questions that you might see on the midterm. Question number 1 is looking at price ceilings and price floors and what exists at price ceilings, price floors. So there's basically going to be a surplus and a shortage that exist. Question number 2 is going to be looking at consumer utility, and you have to figure out that each market basket, the highest one is always the best. And we're looking at what this leads to. When each basket, the highest basket is the one that's most obtained. What is that what we're looking at for that example? Question 3 is looking at a firm that maximizes profits by operating at the level of output is where? Every time you look at a graph, you have to focus on something. What is that something? Question 4 is looking at a mathematical technique used to solve constraint optimization problems. What is that looking at? Question 5. Many reasons why a market cannot be competitive. The principal economic difference between a competitive and a non-competitive market is what? What is the main difference? Question 6. Now, it's going to look at average and marginal product of labor. Look at the relationship between how average and marginal relate to each other. Question 7 is going to be dealing with oligopolies and the kink demand curve and the ranges between inelastic and elastic, the sections on the curve. That's why it's kinked. Question 8 is going to be looking at isoquants and whether a firm can expand and the relationship of whether it can expand. Question 9 is going to be looking at the difference between AVC and ATC and perfectly competitive firms. Question 10 is going to look at isoquants and the slope of isoquants. Question 11 is going to be looking at a perfectly competitive firm earning positive economic profits. And what does that mean? When you look at the positive economic profits, what does that look like in terms of the ATC curve? Question 12 is going to be looking at a person's scenario and their risk and return related to an indifference curve. All indifference curves, you want to make sure that the indifference curve is equal to the budget line. That's the key thing, tangent to it. Question 13 is going to be looking at expected income as a direct measure of well-being. What are the influences of that? Question 14 is going to be looking at technological advancement and how that influences supply and demand, which curve it will influence. Question 15 is going to be looking at elasticities and if a good is more inelastic or elastic. Who pays the burden of the tax? Question 16 is going to be looking at the definition of consumer and producer surplus. Question 17 is going to be looking at the supply curve for a competitive firm. Where does that exist in a competitive firm? Question 18 is going to be looking at consumer behavior. And what are some of the assumptions with consumer behavior? Question 19 is going to be looking at positive and normative economic analysis and trying to relate that to an example. Question 20 is going to be giving you two statements. dealing with perfectly competitive firms, or I should say competitive firms, and highly competitive firms. Question 21 is going to be looking at average cost curve and average variable cost curve and the relationship between those two curves. Question 22 is going to be looking at the bandwagon effect and goods that could be potentially affected by that. Question 23 is going to be looking at the preferences of consumer behavior in markets. Question 24 is going to be looking at supply and demand and appropriate shifts for the demand curve. The key to that is the price of the physical good is not included in that analysis. And the last question is looking at the indifference curves and the challenges between the income and substitution effect. Make sure to note that you get one attempt on the final. You're not allowed to start it and stop it. I know the directions say that, but what that means is once you start it, the clock is always ticking. So you have to end it at that point. I look forward to your work this week.